All right, man. Some surprises, interesting. I got a note here from Mike Ezell. Congressman Stephen Palazzo's pattern of hypocrisy continues after repeatedly introducing legislation to limit members of Congress to 6 terms and then filing to run for re-election to a 7th term. Palazzo is now making a habit of proxy voting in Congress. The same practice he filed a lawsuit to stop, calling it unconstitutional. I asked this question to JT a few minutes ago, and as a guy who has been the chairman of the Mississippi Republican Party and also chief of staff for 2 governors, you cannot take it for granted because you're not in power. You have to have a different mindset as far as an incumbent if you want 2 more years.
Yeah, I mean, the old adage is absolutely right. I mean, you run a race either scared or unopposed, and you've got it's a tough time right now for incumbents generally because the country's heading in the wrong direction, and people are upset about it, and everybody in power is getting penalized for it. You know, there's nothing that Stephen Palazzo or Michael Guest have done to create the situation we're in because they've been in the minority for the last 2 years. But people are mad at the people in power, and you saw a lot of that yesterday.
One of the things that I hate, and I'm not specifically meaning this race because I've been talking about this for a long time. When you see a budget proposal and somebody votes on it, and there's one thing in there that they just went on and voted for it because maybe we had to have the money or whatever it happens to be, the defense budget's in there and everything else. And then they pick out one thing, and in some of these races, they picked out the Planned Parenthood, which I understand, but if you voted against it, then the opponent would say you voted against the defense, and we have all of these infrastructures in Mississippi. You can't win, and I find that specious, and I don't like it, but that's just politics.
It's part of politics, and there's been a change. You know, there's been a real shift in the last 10 or 15 years about appropriations. I mean, you know, Stephen Palazzo's what his core message, I suspect, will be in the runoff is that he's on the House Appropriations Committee, and that the House Appropriations Committee plays a major role in a lot of the institutions inside of his district. You think about Ingalls, you think about the universities, but that's not the asset that it was 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, you know, that was Thad Cochran's greatest asset. He was the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. He brought home the bacon, and that for a long time is what Mississippi voters wanted.
Absolutely.
And there's been a shift against that. There people are rightfully concerned about our burgeoning debt, where we're spending the money, who we're borrowing it from. And so I think it's going to be an interesting race in the 4th Congressional District.
Well, let me clear this up because I don't know if I'm factual on this one, and then bug me forever if I don't get this right. But if you did not vote in the Republican primary yesterday, can you vote in the runoff?
Yes, you did.
You can.
You did not have to vote yesterday to vote on the 28th.
Okay. So you can come back and vote.
That's right. You have to be registered to vote already, but you can show up to vote in the second primary even if you didn't vote in the first.
Okay. Well, I'm glad we corrected that because somewhere in my mind there's one of those little catches where you can if you didn't, and apparently it's not in that particular case.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, the only prohibition is if you voted in the Democratic primary yesterday. You can't show up to the Republican runoff. But if you didn't vote, you're welcome to show up. And Paul, that's going to be the story in the 3rd is identifying voters and getting them out to vote. Because that turnout was down basically 30% from where we were in the 2018 primary when Michael Guest was originally elected. And I think there were a lot of people in the 3rd Congressional District. I think the 4th is different, but I think there were a lot of people in the 3rd Congressional District who assumed Michael had this won. If you had asked me yesterday what I thought was going to happen, I would have told you that the biggest question was whether Michael Guest was going to get 80 or 90%. Yeah. And I think you had a lot of people who do that who said, I got a lot going on. I got to take the kids to school. Michael Guest has this. I'm not going to show up and vote. And so I think that's their campaign's biggest task between now and June 28th is figuring out the people who would have voted for him who didn't show up yesterday and get them to the polls. And that's always difficult.
In this particular case, Lucien Smith is with me, but also Lucien, in this particular case, Michael Cassidy is a worthy opponent. I mean, well-spoken, Navy. So you could take that lightly. And you depend a lot on your home county. If you can't get them out, you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's right. And Michael, he did win Rankin County. He's got a long history there. It wasn't an overwhelming win, but I think a lot of it.
Michael Guest did win Rankin County?
He did win Rankin County, but just barely. It wasn't an 80-20 sort of split.
We had the contrary to that, but again, that was early last night, so that is a change. Which one of these runoffs, in the third or in the fourth, Michael Guest or Stephen Palazzo, would benefit from a low turnout or would not benefit from a low turnout?
I think Michael Guest certainly benefits from high turnout. I think Michael Cassidy benefits from low turnout because the people who are going to show up in a low turnout scenario are the people who are the angriest, the most motivated, and those are going to be the people who are mad at everybody in Washington and want to throw everybody out. So I think a high turnout scenario or a higher turnout scenario is better for Michael in the third. I think it cuts both ways in the fourth. I mean, Palazzo is in a spot. 2/3 of voters in the 4th congressional district voted against him, and 2/3 of Republican primary voters voted against him. And his base of support has always been further upstate. The Pine Belt in particular has been his real base of support. He has not dominated in his home county. Mike Ezell did very well in his own home county in Jackson County, and Bryce Wiggins is also from Jackson County. So you have to assume that Mike is in a good position to consolidate votes in the lower three, and so it's going to be. I think Stephen is going to have to get basically 2 out of every 3 votes in the Pine Belt in order to win in the second race. That's going to be a much more difficult race than the third.
Would you also say that a lot of what happened in this particular race, as far as Palazzo is concerned, self-inflicted? Because the number one thing you do need to do to counter some of these negatives is hit the ground. Work, shake hands, be there, and that was some of the greatest negatives, that he just was a no-show. A lot of different things.
And they hammered him for it. You saw lots about not being present at things. And, I think that's right. I think if you were a public official who wants to stay a public official, you need to show up for just about every event that gives you an opportunity to be in front of voters. Because, to your point, incumbency is generally a great advantage in any race. And part of the reason it's an advantage is people know your name. But related to that is people see you all the time, because you get invited to every Republican women's event. You get invited to every thing out there, and you get to show up and be present. So you got to take advantage of it.
Well, and to answer the question that both of us were talking about a little bit earlier, the things that you can do, the number one thing, far and beyond anything else, that you can do when you're not in power, is you shake as many hands as you can. You spend as much time as you possibly can. It's just one of the very few things that you can do. And you can go and commensurate with all the misery from those damn Democrats being in power.
That's right.
You got to show up. We'll talk more about it with Lucien Smith coming up in a moment. Lucien Smith with us. I don't know how crime figured into this. Probably it didn't figure in other than subliminally. It did in that DA vote.
That was fascinating.
Over in California. That was absolutely, that's stabbed at the heart of liberalism in San Francisco.
And it gives me a lot of hope for how Republicans are going to do in November, because you're starting to see places. You saw this in the New York mayoral election. You definitely saw it in the recall. Chesa Boudin is this far left prosecutor. He is a prosecutor who basically thinks we shouldn't be locking anybody up. And so, things have gotten out of control because, as you know, Paul, people respond to incentives. And if you tell a bunch of criminals, we're not going to arrest you or prosecute you if you steal stuff, there are a bunch of people who are going to say, well, gosh, I'm going to go out and steal stuff. That's free stuff all of a sudden. And he got recalled by far-left constituency out in San Francisco.
61%. I don't care how stupid you are, politically stupid, I should say, when you see crime just exploding in your neighborhood and the people that you put in office are anti-police, anti-bond or bails, or for no bail and all of this thing that they're going for. You have to just almost be in a coma not to react when there is a vote coming up. As far as crime is concerned, we have this story: the folks in Louisville, Mississippi, will have to be home at night for now. The police chief there, Sean Hollinis, I think it is, says in an effort to reduce crime in the city, there's a curfew in Louisville, which may be something that a lot of other cities put in. He said since the weekend, the city has had a drive-by shooting where 3 cars were hit, 2 stolen vehicles, 2 guns taken off of juveniles, and at least 5 car burglaries. Law enforcement said they want to get ahead of what could be a violent summer. The city has a curfew in Louisville now in effect, and the rules are you must be in your home at 10 p.m. and you can leave your home at 5 a.m. The board will revisit the curfew in 2 weeks. So I don't know all the other particulars of that, but it doesn't seem here like it has any age limit on it. I'm sure if you're going to a job or something, you get a pass, but it's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen just a huge rise in crime over the course of the last 2 years, and that's amazing with the curfew. But I do think that's part of. It's probably not I don't think it's the core thing that's driving people's unhappiness with incumbents right now. I think inflation and the economy are probably more of that. But I absolutely think this massive rise in crime all across the country has people mad, and they want to see things change.
Absolutely. Lucien Smith, former chair of the Mississippi Republican Party. Lucien, did you mention this? I don't know if you did Palazzo and his home county. What was the latest on that one?
He got about 30% of the vote in his home county. I'm gonna pull it up here while we're talking, Paul. But
go ahead.
Well, actually, Harrison County's never been his biggest base of support. He's always done better up in the Pine Belt, but he sort of tracked there. Zell, I think, was 20%, 20% there. But I'm gonna grab the Harrison County numbers.
All right.
Yeah, Stephen was at 28, and Ezell was at 17.
How about that? Do you think that the ethics violation had any play in the vote totals?
I doubt it had as big of a play in the vote totals as some people might think. Most of those allegations were brought out 2 years ago by Carl Boynton or Richard Boynton. I forget who it was who ran against him 2 years ago. But those had already been public. I do think what it did is drew a lot of stronger candidates into the race.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of them assumed that at some point he was going to end up dropping out because of it. He didn't have to. And he didn't. But I think that was a big part of why you saw people like Mike Ezell get in that race, because they assumed that it made him vulnerable. And I think having those strong people in the race, especially in this anti-incumbent environment, played a big role.
Now, when you start looking at this, it's been a long time since we've had 2 Democrat congressmen. You got to go back to mostly the first district. Let's see, I think Alan Nunley probably beat. And I forgot who
he beat.
Was.
Travis Childers.
Travis Childers, cookie cutter commercial.
That's right.
That.
That was such a. This has always been one of the interesting things about Palazzo, and I think it is something that he's had to deal with his entire time in Congress. Is when you at the very beginning of 2010. Nobody thought Stephen Palazzo could win. They thought Gene Taylor was absolutely unbeatable. You didn't have any, he was a first-term member of the legislature, and you had a lot of people who would have thought, I should be the congressman from the 4th Congressional District, but you can't be Gene Taylor. And Stephen actually had the guts to run against him. And a lot of people thought he was the sacrificial lamb, but I was working to help get the vote out with a lot of other volunteers, and we were initially going to help Nunley. But in the last few weeks of the campaign, it became clear that Allen was going to beat Childers pretty handily. Mm-hmm. And so the party redirected volunteers down to the Palazzo campaign because we realized we actually did have a chance to beat Gene Taylor, and ultimately did it. But I think you've had, he's always had these people who've talked about running against him in primaries, because I think a lot of them who didn't run in 2010 think, man, I should have been the guy who did it. But, you only win if you actually put your name on the ballot.
Yeah. Gene was and is, I guess. I haven't heard from him in a while. I think he did switch over to the Republican Party.
He did. Yeah, he ran against Congressman Palazzo in 2 years later in a primary, and Congressman Palazzo beat him in the Republican primary.
I haven't talked to him in a while, but I think his politics now probably would be more like Michael Cassidy than anybody else.
He was always a pretty conservative,
yes, he was.
Pretty conservative Democrat. He was sort of
and very, very headstrong, and he bucked his own party when he was a Democrat.
Oh,
a
absolutely.
lot of times.
I think he didn't vote for. I think there were at least some cycles where he didn't vote for Pelosi, but I may be wrong about that. Maybe people just offered him up as an alternative.
That was tremendously interesting. But that final vote from Mississippi voted for Nancy Pelosi as for a speaker.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that did him in.
Oh yeah, and that was the core message.
Yeah, that's old stuff. So I look forward to continuing this conversation. Who's the stronger candidate if this comes out to meet Dupree? Because as you mentioned, that vote block in the Pine Belt area is very, very important, and former mayor has a lot of following in that area. So who's the stronger candidate to prevent the Democrats from winning that congressional seat?
I think whoever wins the Republican primary is going to handily beat Johnny Dupree. I think Congressman Palazzo will beat him. I think Mike Ezell will beat him because, for starters, it's a very conservative district. Hadn't elected a Democrat, obviously, since Gene Taylor was elected last in 2008. But this is just an environment where it's going to be very difficult for any Democrat to win, especially in a congressional election, because this is going to be a referendum very clearly on Joe Biden's policies. And the question that a well-run campaign will have is, when you go to the polls, do you want to vote for Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, or do you want to vote for the conservatives? And I think that's going to be a very, very easy message to that's a message that's going to resonate with voters. I mean, you still have to run a serious campaign to make sure the word gets out, but if that message gets out adequately, nobody's going to have any trouble beating Johnny Dupree.
More now than since Jimmy Carter days, and that's true. Today is also Name Your Poison Day, so that's Name Your Poison, the Democrat Party. So that's not exactly what you want. So what does Ezell have to do to put on your political consulting hat? What does he have to do to make this happen?
So Mike's got to do two things. He's got to consolidate his voters in the lower six counties. He's got to make sure the coast voters are solidly Ezell people, and he's got to cut into Stephen's strength in the Pine Belt. If I were Mike Ezell, I'd be making a call to Chris McDaniel, see if he was willing to get in that race. And he's like we said earlier, 2/3 of the voters in that primary didn't vote for Congressman Palazzo, and so both Ezell and Stephen are going after the people who did not vote for him. And so I think for Ezell to win, what he's got to do is convince those people who, for whatever reason, chose not to vote for Congressman Palazzo and tell them why he is the better of the two candidates. And really, Palazzo's got to do the opposite of that. He's got to prevent Ezell from dominating in the coastal counties, and he's got to convince the folks who didn't vote for him the first time that it's in their best interest to vote for him on June 28th.
But in the same manner, I mean, he's got to get on the phone, call some folks who have some influence too.
That's right,
and call some markers if he has any.
And hopefully, I mean, if he needs to be going after the other candidates and seeing if he can get some of them to endorse him.
Final segment coming up in a moment or two, but I'm interested to pick your political brain. What does Cassidy have to do? When we come back in the final segment with Lucien Smith right after this.
Cookie cutter, and they're tired of cookie cutter candidates. Cookie cutter, we're not a cookie cutter candidate. Cookie cutter, that's a cookie cutter message.
Down in the kingdom,
those archives never go away, do they?
They're forever.
Hey, you'll appreciate this, talking about maybe some things happening. There was a lot of energy in the New Mexico governor's race last night. The incumbent governor is the Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, and the Republican who won as projected winner is a former TV meteorologist, Mark Ronchetti, won the gubernatorial primary, so that's going to be interesting to watch that coming up in November.
I think we got a bunch of pickup opportunities in the governor's races just because people are fed up with the Democrats.
Would you agree, because a lot of people are saying when you start taking all of these, and a lot of them are young Republicans, especially in the House, that the House is going to take on more of a flavor, and they didn't say this, but let me say it, more of a Jim Jordan flavor.
I hope so. I mean, I think the biggest challenge Republicans, I think Republicans are going to win. I think we're going to take back the House. I think we will take back the Senate. But this has always been our problem. We talk a great game when the Democrats are in charge. It's easy to get on the radio and say, we need to stop all this bad spending by Joe Biden, which is absolutely true. But we've got to do it when we're in charge also, and I think that's. I hope that you were right that the House has a more Jim Jordan feel, and I frankly I would like to see him become Speaker over Kevin McCarthy. I mean, because I just think McCarthy's one of these classic politicians who tells you whatever you want to hear, and then turns around and looks at the polling data and figures out what the best thing is for him politically. And I just think people want leaders, people want real conservatives. Like that's the point, Paul. That's why we're electing these people.
One of the more aggravating things is when we had the opportunity to brand a counter to Obamacare, we never did it. Absolutely never did it. We should have been working on it, had it all together. You didn't have have to have all the specifics. All you had to have was the outline. Here's what you didn't even tell people how you were going to do it. Just put the outlines and bullet points, brand it, and you had time to do that. But they never did it.
They never did.
And I think it was a failure of leadership back in those days.
Oh, absolutely, it was.
When Haskert, and then of course Paul Ryan and the marijuana guy, Mr. Bonner. But to leave it that. What does Michael Cassidy have to do to win?
Well, he's got to start cut. He's got to make sure first his voters show back up. And I think that will be easy for him, because I think most of the people who showed up and voted for him are likely to be very motivated because they want to throw everybody out in Washington. But he's also got to prevent Michael Guest from increasing his own vote share. I think most of the people who voted for the third candidate in that race are likely to vote for Cassidy. I think they'll break pretty significantly for him in the second runoff. In the runoff. But I think he's got to reach out to people who didn't show up, didn't vote for him, and I think he's going to be forced. In a lot of ways, he was able to get away with a pretty, in my view, vague message. I mean, I don't think we know very much about Michael Cassidy. We know he's not from Mississippi. We know he lives here now, and he had a very consistent America First, pro-Trump message, but I think he's going to have to go into greater detail, and I think the Guest campaign is going to have to do a job of defining Cassidy. You didn't see any real contrast work in this race. There was very little framing up by the Guest campaign of who Michael Cassidy was, what's he really for, and why it was important to keep Guest. And so I think you're going to see a lot more contrast work in the runoff of defining Cassidy, and generally that's a good strategy. If you've got an opponent running against an incumbent, I mean, the general rule is not to talk about them because you don't want to increase their name ID. But with Cassidy getting well into the mid 40s, I think there's going to be a lot more conversation about who is this guy, what's he really for, and I think that's going to be a pretty sustained message coming from outside.
And one of the other things that old war horses know, this is when ground game really matters, and you got to have it all out there. And to my mind, this plays into the incumbent because they've had their ground game established for a while. They've got their political people out there. They know what's going on, so they can be on the ground more. And I don't think it favors Ezell or Cassidy in that particular case.
That is 100% of what's going to go on in those campaigns, or the overwhelming majority is identifying the people who didn't show up, who would have been for me, and making sure they show back up on June 28th.
I think, was Trent Kelly the only one who got the Trump endorsement?
Paul, I honestly don't know that question.
Yeah, I know that Trent did, but I don't remember seeing that from anybody else. Always good talking politics with you, man.
Hey, you too, Paul. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, the one and only Lucien Smith, former chair of the Republican Party, and we thank you.